Merci. You wanted something in French. Now, you've just heard from David about one of Voltaire's most significant activities in life during his era, his affair with a brilliant and I think actually a very underappreciated woman. And David could have talked a good deal more about what actually Emily said about science and what Voltaire said about science, but that's another story. We won't talk more about that. Now, I want to turn your attention now to a much less spectacular, but I think equally important issue that was referred to by Keith Baker, for which Voltaire is celebrated, but by specialists today in his own time, and that's the subject of toleration. Now, he published an influential treatise in 1763, rather late in his life, entitled Traité sur la tolérance, and we revere him as the main champion of the campaign against religious fanaticism, one of the hallmarks of the Enlightenment, a hallmark that probably prepared the way for a re-examination of the issues by Louis XVI, and was certainly on the minds of the early advocates of the French Revolution that began in earnest a dozen years after his death. You are probably aware that the French Assembly voted for a bill proposed by the Abbé Grégoire to liberate blacks and Jews by giving them equal access to civic status, subject to the same citizenship laws as the majority of other Frenchmen. This was one of the much touted accomplishments of the new French state, which proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity as its watchword. The monopoly enjoyed during the old regime by the Catholic Church and sanctioned by the Crown was abolished in 1790. Its ownership of property was confiscated by the new French state. And the question is, how did the legacy of Voltaire's career and those other old regime philosophes impact these momentous events? This is a classic question debated by historians about the central causes of the French Revolution. Now, some have argued that the anti-Christian bias of many Enlightenment writers set the stage for this revolutionary turn of events. And others have gone much farther, claiming that many of these philosophes were secretly materialist atheists who campaigned for the abandonment of all religious beliefs, seen as dangerous, superstitious holdovers from earlier times. Now, the new rational science of Newton, backed by mathematical and atomistic thinking, seemed to demand a renunciation of all credulous beliefs based on the presumptive word of God as set down in scriptures. And that was certainly the position taken by Laplace, Newton's great French champion in the late Enlightenment, about whom I've written a whole book. He was often derided as an atheist by the faithful. But what about Voltaire? Surely he was a firm advocate of rationality, of science, and one of its chief architects, Sir Isaac Newton. So we need to understand how he stood on this much contentious issue. Now, there's a wonderful anecdote told of the scene around his deathbed in 1778 in Paris. There was a priest at his deathbed, anxious to bring him fully back into the fold of Catholic orthodoxy, and he pleaded with him. He said, "Would you declare now that you completely renounce the devil?" And Voltaire is said to have quipped, "My good man, this is no time to make enemies." whether true or not, this dialogue is characteristic of the cunning reputation Voltaire had gained with his numerous plays and novels. He was a man full of charm and wit, apparently even on his deathbed. In a manner typical of the man, he refused to answer straight out what his beliefs were about the stories of evil that linked the devil to the New Testament. To me, it is clear that he was a strong and conventional believer in a supreme being, but he was not one who necessarily endorsed God's exact words as recounted in the Bible. Voltaire was convinced that there was order and rationality in nature, and that this aspect of nature demonstrated the world was a byproduct of such a rational, supreme being. Like Newton and many other scientists, he adhered to the argument of the existence of a deity, given the order and design that reigned in this world. Hence, he was, at the very least, a deist or a theist, whichever term you prefer to use. But to believe in the existence of the devil was clearly out of bounds. Now let me now quote from an edition of the Philosophical Dictionary published at about the same time as the Treatise on Toleration. It is a fairly clear statement that represents Voltaire's stance in the 1760s. What is a theist? Quote, "Theist. The theist is a man firmly persuaded of the existence of a supreme being, as good as he is powerful, who has created all beings that are extensive, vegetative, sentient, and reflective, who perpetuates their species, who punishes crimes without cruelty, and rewards virtuous actions with kindness. The theist does not know how God punishes, how he protects, how he pardons, for he is not bold enough to flatter himself that he knows how God acts, but he knows that God acts and that he is just. United by this principle with the rest of the universe, he does not embrace any of the sects," and this is Voltaire, definitely, "all of which contradict one another. His religion is the most ancient and most widespread, for the simple worship of God has preceded all the systems of the world. He speaks a language that all peoples understand, while they do not understand one another. He has brothers from Beijing to Cayenne, and he counts all wise men as his brethren. He believes that religion does not consist either in the opinions of an unintelligible metaphysic or in vain display, but in worship and justice." That's clearly Voltaire. While I would not wish to quarrel with his definition or spend time parsing his opinion, it raises two issues for me. First, the timing of the statement coming rather late in his life. Voltaire was more than 70 years old when he exploded into the public arena with these clear and provocative views. And secondly, how did this stand on toleration square with his earlier pronouncements about individual religious sects, particularly Jews? Was he consistent in his attitude concerning tolerance throughout his lifetime, or did his views evolve with time? And if so, what provoked him to condemn intolerance and fanaticism in 1763? After all, there had been a host of pronouncements about the issue at the time of his birth that were old hat in the latter part of the Enlightenment. Let me review briefly the discussion going back to his early life, before, in fact, at the time of his birth, when John Locke wrote his famous letter concerning toleration, and Pierre Bayle published his critical historical dictionary a few years later. These were essentially discussions about tolerance of the various Christian sects which had spawned the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries that had torn Western Europe apart politically as well as religiously. They were written by authors concerned mostly by events in the Protestant worlds of Britain and the Low Countries, and Voltaire must have learned about them during his 2-year exile in England. At issue for them was the necessity of separating church and state in order to maintain a civil society. But the situation in the Catholic world, particularly in France, was quite different. You probably know that in order to quell the religious wars there, a new king of France, Henry of Navarre, Protestant by birth, converted to Catholicism in 1593 and proclaimed a famous Edict of Nantes, offering Protestants sanctuaries in several provincial cities and allowing them in a limited and well-defined way to follow their faith. The Catholic religion nonetheless remained the official state religion in France. But towards the end of the century, Louis XIV revoked this act in 1685, and there followed a series of other governmental acts throughout the early 18th century condemning Jansenism and clamping down on religious freedom. Now, of particular interest for us was Louis XV's declaration of 1724, which addressed the issue of new converts from Protestantism to Catholicism. The presumption was that after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, all Protestants had either emigrated, as a great number called Huguenots actually did, or had abandoned their faith in order to continue living in France. Those new Catholics who might be induced to return to Protestant faith were relapsed Catholics and therefore to be dealt with severely. In southwestern France, there were in fact ongoing efforts by Calvinists to recapture these lost souls. For a few years in the early decades of the 1700s, there was in fact an open revolt in the mountains near Toulouse and Montpellier in the Cévennes region, which was put down by force. Then Calvinists led by Antoine Cour turned to clandestine preaching in deserted quarries near Nîmes. This was the social unrest being addressed by the new edicts of 1724. If caught, relapsed male Catholics in principle were shipped off to galleys in perpetuity, women imprisoned, and preachers executed. Calvinist marriages were deemed illegitimate, and hence their children should be treated as bastards. Now, application of the laws varied from place to place and were handled locally. Now, in Toulouse, for example, a certain pastor, Pastor Rochette, was tried before the local judges, the Capitules, and he was executed in 1761, a year before the famous Calas affair broke out. Nonetheless, some Huguenots were in practice allowed to live in town. They were well known, however, as minorities living with very limited rights. It was this affair, the Calas affair, that brought Voltaire fully out into the public arena. In fact, the Traité sur la tolérance has the subtitle "On the Occasion of the Death of Jean Calas." His trial, torture, and execution was made a cause célèbre by Antoine Cour's son, and above all by Voltaire, who eventually managed to have the court's sentence reversed, but long after Calas's death. Briefly, what was this famous or infamous story? Jean Calas was a Protestant draper in Toulouse. He was the father of 6 children, whose 26-year-old son, the eldest, Marc-Antoine, was found dead in his home on October 13th, 1761. Another son, Louis, had previously converted to Catholicism, and it was rumored that Marc-Antoine was about to do the same. The authorities accused the parents of murdering their son to prevent this conversion. Now, I won't go into details about the circumstances, about the testimony given by Jean Calas and then retracted. He claimed in the end that his son had hung himself, and the character witnesses who testified at his trial. A guilty verdict was handed down after 5 months of hearings. Calas continued to deny his guilt, even while broken on the torture rack. He was then put out of his misery in the town square. Now, much has been written about the trial and the reasons for his condemnation. Technically, Calas was executed because he was found guilty by judges of homicide. But in fact, popular sentiment against him was fueled by the presumption that the Calas family wanted to prevent another embarrassing conversion. Actually, a year later, another Protestant, Sirven, living near Toulouse, was accused of killing his daughter, who was found dead at the bottom of a well. Prodded by nuns in whose care she had been placed, she had expressed a desire to convert to Catholicism. Sirven and his wife were convicted in absentia of murder and ordered hung. Fortunately for them, they had left the country for Switzerland, but their very flight was taken as an admission of guilt. Later, they returned to France, were retried, and found innocent. Most likely, their somewhat retarded daughter was the victim of an accident at the bottom of the well. Now, these cases were known to Voltaire, living at the time in Switzerland. He organized a campaign to reverse the clear prejudices Toulouse authorities had displayed against Calvinists and their efforts to persuade their offsprings to remain Protestant. Following these notorious incidents and the reversal of their verdicts, the French crown adopted a somewhat more lenient attitude, and by 1787, King Louis XVI published an Edict of Toleration, which gave legal sanction to the civil rights of Huguenots. We must remember, I think, that the main issue centered around the rights of various Christian sects, not atheists or believers in other religions. The two other groups most often mentioned by Voltaire were Jews and Muslims. Now, before turning to them, let me briefly go over the views Voltaire brilliantly argued in his treatise on toleration. For those of you trained in the law or philosophy who decide to read this tract, I warn you from the outset that it is written by a masterful literary artist, not by a legal theorist. He makes his point by telling stories, historical and mythical, that are meant to arouse emotions more than logic. From the horrible capital punishment, the supplice in French, endured by Calas, he quickly generalizes by offering well-known examples from history. And the litany of evils, murders, mistakes committed by humans over the ages, as you well know, is quite staggering. Voltaire does not begin with the present or near past, even if this is his clear goal. Foremost among them is the death of Socrates, obviously engendered by the Athenian authorities who would not allow him to corrupt youth by offering them a critical philosophical approach to truth. Voltaire, from the start, contrasts freedom of investigation by thinkers like himself from the dictates of the state. By analogy, the philosophes of his days are immediately set against prejudiced authorities like the Capitoul of Toulouse. He says, Socrates, who came closest to understanding the Creator, died as a martyr to divinity. But interestingly, Voltaire is anxious to list this monumental breach against humanity as, and I quote, the only one the Greeks ever perpetrated against someone for his opinions. Why did he insist this was the exception to their practice? Now today, we've learned enough about Athenian practices to know that others were exiled for acts against authority or against the Olympian gods. But Voltaire, as a master of the narrative rather than as a faithful historian, wanted to assert that the ancient Greeks were closer to the ideal of tolerance than their followers. In fact, Voltaire idealized all sorts of ancient civilization as peoples who had come closer to its tolerant ideals than modern man. He even lauded the Romans, whom we remember for their persecution of nascent Christianity. In their defense, in defense of the Romans, he cited none other than St. Paul, who indicated that it was not customary for Romans to condemn a man without having his accusers before him. Paul had a different scenario. He indicated it was not even the Romans who stoned St. Stephen to death, but the Jews. Voltaire even exonerated Domitian by claiming that Christians were only exiled by him for less than a year. I could go on with other ways that Voltaire twisted Roman behavior to suit his plan. He cleverly bypasses the issue of the crucifixion of Jesus, actually the first Christian martyr. Pilate is not mentioned. Who else but Jews could be responsible for this crime? Now, all this maneuvering is crafted in order to accuse Jews and Christians of fanatic adherence to their beliefs. I'll come back to the Jews in a moment. The only reason some Romans killed Christians, Voltaire insisted, was a result of Christians' inordinate zeal for their own faith. Christians were the ones who could not tolerate other religious views. Did they not massacre others during the Crusades? Did they not exterminate the Albigensian heretics? And what about the infamous Spanish Inquisition? Truly, the world turned away from the initial benign approach of most Greeks and Romans when Christianity came to the fore. Now, it must be remembered that Voltaire had throughout his life been outraged by Christian orthodoxy for its practical consequences. The great Christian councils of the 4th and 5th centuries decided for the faithful what was right and condemned all that was wrong, preaching a vengeance that smacked of fanaticism. Early Christians thought they could interpret the word of God by conclaves of elders, which defined dogmas for their believers. Not content with this analysis, Voltaire heaped upon the New Testament the charge of exaggerating events to make a doctrinal point. The Bible, he insisted, is full of unsubstantiated legends and stories that any rational man cannot believe in good conscience. These were truly fables meant to turn humble humans into persecuted and martyred Christians, many of whom had defied Roman authorities. Hence their banishment from Roman society. We should pause here and reflect upon the newly minted treatises that various historians of the late 17th century, who had begun to consider the New Testament not as a divine word, but as a human invention devoid of divine character. Voltaire, of course, was not original in pointing out the contradictions between stories told by St. Mark or St. Luke, the inconsistencies in the stories of Jesus' miracles as recounted by different evangelists. How could any reasonable man of the Enlightenment accept the Bible as a divine document? And what kind of fanatic behavior derived from men who were so certain about the tenets of Christianity that they acted brutally to persecute unbelievers? Not content with turning Greeks and Romans into paragons of tolerance, he commandeered an idealized version of Chinese civilization to buttress his case. Voltaire focuses less on their Confucian faith, with which he might have scored some points, than on their governmental practices, by implication contrasting them favorably when set against French habits. Now, Voltaire exhibits once more his clever ability to turn historical examples on their head for his own purposes. As you know, Jesuit missionaries sent to the Far East were banished from China in 1724. Now, one would expect this to be an argument against the tolerance of the Chinese court. Not Voltaire. He asserts that Confucian courts were remarkably tolerant for over a century by originally welcoming these foreigners. But Jesuits were finally denounced for secretly trying to convert the courts to Christianity in an effort to colonize the Far East. Jesuits were operating with what we might call like a fifth column, threatening the civil order, a perfectly legitimate reason for their banishment. So these devious fanatic Christians were expelled. But Voltaire underlines that Chinese emperors had them escorted to their ships so that they would not suffer the people's insults. In a remarkable passage of the Treatise on Toleration, he says, "The emperor was merely removing foreign agitators, but see with what goodness he was sending them away, what paternalism he evinced by protecting them on their voyage from insults. Their very banishment was an example of tolerance and humanity." Now, I'm not going to try to justify Voltaire's misuse of history beyond saying that he was willing to use any argument that would lead to the overthrow of the prejudiced fanaticism that had recently murdered Pastor Rochette, tortured Calas, and condemned Sylvain. Why not, he insisted, copy the recent examples of the English-speaking nation? In a multitude of his writings, he extols what he experienced in his short stay in Britain, and in another passage in the Treatise on Toleration, he cheers that nation by enumerating the variety of religious beliefs to be found there. Quote, "Today, the difference between faiths causes no problems. The Jew, Catholic, Greek, Lutheran, Calvinist, Anabaptist, Socinian, Mennonite, Moravian, and countless others live as brothers in these lands and contribute equally to the well-being of society." And this attitude had even spread to the British colonies, he said, that he portrays as religious utopias from the Carolinas to the Quaker-dominated Philadelphia. Now contrast this with the sorry state of persecution of Protestants by Catholics in France. Voltaire lists one after another the crimes committed in the name of the state religion during the French Wars of Religion. Under Francis I, in 1545, the French massacred the villagers of Mérindol and Cabrières, razed their towns solely because they were Calvinists. And more terrifying were the bloodbaths of the massacre of St. Bartholomew in 1572, when thousands of Protestants were slaughtered. By evoking these recent events, Voltaire was able to connect these massive human tragedies with the personal tragedies in Calas's time. Had the French reverted to these horrible times? Clearly, it was time to turn one's back on the past and become a modern, enlightened nation. Calas's name had to be cleared, and it was, thanks to the brilliant campaign waged by Voltaire. Now, I want to turn now to the question that I have been avoiding. How can I explain Voltaire's repeated calls for religious tolerance and his often derogatory comments about Jews? The simple answer might be that he was by nature anti-Semitic. For a moment, I need to confess a personal interest in this question. when I was a youngster at the lycée in Cahors during the Second World War, the Vichy government published an anthology of Voltaire's writings in which his anti-Jewish comments were collected and reproduced, part of the government's propaganda against Jews. I was much too young to think anything about it, but at the recent meeting of the International Society of 18th Century Studies in Montpellier, one of the plenary speakers referred to this fact, which took me aback. I have since tried to understand what seems on the face of it self-contradictory. After all, he said in his treatise on tolerance, how could he be anti-Semitic? One phrase in his treatise seems to suggest he knew, as a rational Enlightenment thinker, that one must accept all faiths as they come. He said, I tell you, we must regard all men as our brothers. What, the Turk, my brother? The Chinese, my brother? The Jew? The Siamese? Yes, without a doubt. But then he commented in another place that Jews were, and I quote, the greatest scoundrels who have ever sullied the face of this globe. Now let me establish a few facts. Voltaire writes about Jews quite out of proportion to their importance in France in his time. One author, Ronald Schechter, has labeled him obsessed with Jews. He has counted the number of times the term Jew and its variant is used by Voltaire in his printed work, and he's come up with a number 4,394. Admittedly, a very high count when compared to other references, such as the references to the English. If Schechter had also enumerated how often the word appears in the more than 21,000 letters now published in 153 volumes of Voltaire, that figure would have ballooned even more. Moreover, Schechter is not the only modern author to underscore Voltaire's unusual concern with Jews. The significant Zionist author, Arthur Hertzberg, in his classic book, The French Enlightenment and Jews, concludes that Voltaire not only made disparaging comments about them, but that his views were taken by his contemporaries as evidence that he was the enemy of Judaism. It's not my conclusion, but I want to let Hertzberg speak for himself. Quote, being born a Jew and the obnoxiousness of the Jewish outlook are indissoluble. It is unlikely that enlightened Jews can escape their innate character. The Jews are subversive of the European tradition by their very presence, for they are radically other, the hopeless alien. Cure them of their religion, and their inborn character remains. Now, how did Voltaire characterize Jews or caricature them? Now, I won't subject you to the 4,394 references, which frankly I've not tried to locate. But one common feature is rather typical, since he pictured Jews as unscrupulous moneylenders, avid for profit, and often disreputable. There were actually good reasons for this, including his personal experience. When he arrived in London in 1726, he was supposed to collect money that had been sent to a Jewish banker, Mendes da Costa, but could not because Mendes da Costa had declared bankruptcy 6 months earlier. He remembered this episode some 40 years later when he referred to it in a minor work entitled A Christian Against 6 Jews. Then when in Prussia visiting Frederick the Great in the 1750s, Voltaire had monetary dealings with another Jewish banker in Berlin named Abraham Hirschel that also ended badly for him after a trial in which he lost, so my sources tell me, 1,000 écus. It's a lot of money. It was probably a speculative venture in bonds that went awry. Aside from these incidents, Voltaire appears to have had little personal or human contact with Jews in France, neither in the Rhineland, where some 40,000 Ashkenazi Jews were permitted to live, nor with the so-called Portuguese Sephardic Jews of the Bordeaux region, a much smaller community of about 3,000 souls. He does not seem to have encountered any while at Cirey, where he lived with Émilie, nor later in Ferney near Geneva. But he was certainly familiar with what his contemporaries said about living Jews in France, but his voluminous correspondence does not reveal that he was fixated upon them. So why so many references? Many of them are in a combative treatise entitled The Bible at Last Explained, La Bible enfin expliquée, a diatribe against sacred books and part of his campaign to dethrone Catholicism from its privileged position in France. Voltaire strove to belittle its alleged divine character, reducing it to a series of colorful stories meant to attract the common man, but ones that cannot fool the enlightened. Many of his comments about Jews are really comments about Judaism and its nefarious character as the ethical foundation of the New Testament. In one way, this was not too difficult given the many unsavory passages in the Old Testament that celebrated murder, incest, and cruelty. Voltaire was fond of pointing out that Old Testament Jews themselves were not merely intolerant, but violent and barbarous in their treatment of infidels. Curiously, he does not speak about the crucifixion of Christ, which is an example that has been exploited by a host of later anti-Semites. But there is plenty of evidence in the Old Testament for his venom. The immorality and depravity of ancient Hebrews is rather easy to demonstrate. He returns more than once to the massive massacre of Jews perpetrated on those who worship the golden calf. And the story of Jephthah's daughter and the retribution meted out by the elders is another example of the ferocious nature of ancient Jews, told in the Old Testament without apology or remorse. They practiced human sacrifices, he says. He also reminds his public constantly of the promiscuous behavior of patriarchs. The scholars who have examined his treatment of Judaism have dug up many more negative assessments that Voltaire laid upon this ancient tribe. The most authoritative text by my friend Bertrand Schwarzbach explains many of these diatribes away. But the principal argument is that Voltaire criticized Judaism to prepare the way for rejection of many of the features of the New Testament. After all, he had mounted a lifelong campaign against Orthodox Christianity, especially its Roman Catholic version. He shared many of these attitudes with other notable figures of the French Enlightenment, among them Bayle, Montesquieu, d'Alembert, Holbach, Condorcet. With the ironic twist so characteristic of Voltaire, he even claimed that the Christians were worse than the Jews. Civilization had started slipping into its barbarous state when fanatics began to assert the absolute truth of their version of monotheism. Although I have a little time to develop this, he was also quite antagonistic to Muslims, themselves inheritors of Jewish and Christian errors. One of his tragic plays, entitled Fanaticism or the Prophet Mohammed, 1741, had actually to be withdrawn from the public after few performances because it was too extreme. And just recently, the play was blocked from another performance in Geneva by Muslim pressure groups coming at about the same time as the prophet was caricatured in cartoons published in Denmark. You may remember this. This entirely imaginary play, which takes place in Mecca and has a complicated story, a series of mishaps, is really put together so that he says that the Muslim religion, like Judaism and Christianity, is to be avoided because its adherents are fanatic in carrying out their beliefs. Those sectarians who are sure, by virtue of whatever biblical text they take as authority, are deeply mistaken. What's particularly galling about Jews, in Voltaire's views, is that their fanaticism will not abate as they become more and more enlightened. In fact, this is one of the most strongly worded anti-Semitic arguments I have found, which was strangely echoed 2 centuries later by Hitler. Jews, Voltaire felt, were radically different from other religious sects. They rarely converted, and in the case of Marranos, they secretly practiced their faith while pretending to be Christians. We know that this is one of the main issues that the Spanish Inquisition would investigate when some of the converted Jews were brought before its court. Their faith, get this, kept them living together in special quarters of cities where they were allowed to live. They rarely married out of their religious community. Indeed, Voltaire believed some were even denied full participation in their own faith by their elders if they fraternized too closely with Christians. In other words, they would not assimilate with the rest of society. Now, you and I know that this is a two-way street, since the majority of Frenchmen treated them as the other and had rules that prevented them from assimilating to Christian society. For me, what stands out in Voltaire's comments is that Jews adhere to their religion with remarkable persistence. As one author has said, they are obstinate. Given this innate separatist singularity, they cannot be expected to change as time progresses. Their unvarying set of principles and practices prevent them from accepting the universalistic values preached by Enlightenment thinkers. So, Voltaire's demand for tolerance was precisely this: a general frame of mind that 18th century men, and especially governments, ought to adopt. But if Jews were not malleable because of their essentialist character, what hope was there for this sect? And here I've almost misspoken of Jews as a race, which is, of course, the key phrase in modern anti-Semitism. I think we must be reminded here that there was no genetic view of various ethnic groups in the 18th century, as there has been in the 20th. The exceptionalism Voltaire attributed to Jews was fueled by their biblical origins, by their self-righteousness, by their obstinate behavior. Was it possible, one Sephardic Jew named Da Pinto asked, to become a philosophe without losing his original beliefs? Voltaire seems to have thought that one must shed one's origins to become truly enlightened, something he claimed Jews could not do. As one colorful commentator has phrased it, the Jews were not pictured as biodegradable elements of modern society. The distance between this conclusion and the modern version of anti-Semitism, I think, is very subtle. Now, I'm led by this argument to comment on the role of Voltaire's ideas may have played in the transition to later times. In the case of France, why were Voltaire's views not reflected in the French Revolution's emancipation of French Jews in 1791? In a more general way, I ask myself if efforts to incorporate Jews and indeed other outsiders into predominantly Christian cultures will ever succeed as long as they act as outsiders, different from the majority, as long as they insist upon having their synagogues and mosques, as long as they observe different holidays, follow different rituals, dress differently. Surely religious tolerance involves the acceptance of the variety of religious practice. For Voltaire, the best way to reach this utopian goal is for the majority culture to abandon its fanatic adherence to its own practices. Even more important, it is for political society to abandon its official alliance with established religion. Please, no more theocratic societies, said Voltaire. And that's precisely what began to happen in the French Revolution, but with a violence that still shocks us. As you know, the priest was dethroned, a new state religion devoted to nature and reason was proclaimed. But of course, this extreme solution brought about the terror, started wars, cost countless lives, and after the French Revolution, forced a return to some of the old regime practices, including the Catholic Church. But by 1905, in France, church and state were legally separated. And of course, the story does not end there. With the current challenge of Islam in France, how tolerant can a society be when it feels assaulted by elements that are foreign to its values? Is there a single moral to be drawn from these comments? I leave that to you as something to munch on during your luncheon. My own conclusion is that the much-touted progressive views about tolerance proclaimed in the French Enlightenment, with Voltaire as its emblematic figure, had its serious shortcomings. Modernity did not emerge full-blown from it, and perhaps we're not fully there yet today. Thank you.